What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Kelvy Bird, and she opens the space for me to explore visual facilitation or scribing from an entire new dimension. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes and download my free one-page summary. And now, lean back and be ready to be inspired. Kelvy Bird, the one and only. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored and grateful to be here.
I'm very much looking forward to learn from you and to be curious about you and your work on behalf of the audience. And I always start with the same question. When did you start calling yourself a facilitator? And actually, do you?
Yeah, so I was thinking about that this morning, and I realized it was going back to when I started learning about scribing, which was in about 1994, 95. And the network that I was working with, which was called the M.G. Taylor Corporation Group, called the role graphic facilitation. So I came in with that term, but I never really considered myself a facilitator. I didn't think that I was doing anything that was really helping people. But then I was involved with that same group doing process facilitation, where I was one of the people coordinating the team and the variety of facilitative roles. And then I felt like I was facilitating, like I was actually moving pieces around to create conditions of learning for others. And then it really wasn't until years later that I felt that I did the same thing with my scribing or with visuals. So it took a while. Yeah.
What has changed? Was it the skill set or the mindset that has changed?
Probably both, because growing up, I was involved in high school. I was involved in theater productions. And so those were probably initial facilitative activities on my part. And that was more familiar with me, organizing people and organizing things and trying to help a process. And I studied art in college, but I didn't really pair the art with facilitation until years later. So I think it was my own confidence with my abilities to draw something that might help someone in some way, and also time and practice doing it.
Yeah. And you mentioned before that when you took the visual graphic facilitation course, you didn't really see how this would be helpful for a group.
Well, I saw others doing it, and I saw it helpful when others were scribing. I just lacked my own voice, my own vocabulary, my own style and approach. And it probably was a mental model or my own thinking of who am I to be making sense of what people are saying? Who am I to be the one drawing on a wall and synthesizing things for others? So I knew it was possible because I saw others doing it. I just felt far from that place.
Sounds like an imposter.
Yeah, but I actually didn't do it. I was so shy about it and so self-conscious that I didn't scribe. I was in those environments and brought in because of my art background to scribe, but then I couldn't really do it. So I did everything else, but.
So what did you have to leave behind from your education in art to become a real scribe?
Well, that's such a good question, because with painting or studio art, it's your own expression. You're choosing what to draw or what to represent or how to do it. You're choosing the scale. You're choosing the context. You're choosing if you sell it or not, if it's seen or not. But with scribing, it's so exposed, or graphic facilitation, it's so exposed and witnessed and public, and it's in service of a group. It's not my content or my perspective on something necessarily. It's my ability to understand what other people are talking about and reflect that back to them in an accurate way. so that it's a record of their experience, not a record of my experience. And that's a big difference.
I was just wondering, to what extent is there, so I'm thinking of a representation of nature or a landscape, for instance, and you can have an impressionist expression of that, an expressionist or naturalistic view.
Mm-hmm.
Would this also exist in the scribing, that you can bring what is to a different level and thereby help maybe the viewer better understand what has happened in the workshop?
Yeah. It's interesting you bring up different styles of art, because I hadn't really ever put that in parallel to different approaches of scribing. And I'm just wondering, just to check, does your audience know what scribing is?
Thank you for asking. Maybe you want to explain what the difference between scribing and graphic facilitation is.
Well, I tend to just dive right in. So I had like a little moment of,
and I couldn't wait. So hopefully you don't forget your answer.
No, I won't, because I can weave it in. So scribing is essentially a practice of drawing while people speak. So you're making visible the conversation. I mean, that's kind of how I describe it to my mother. So like, that's the basic description. And it's real time, it's live. It's when we were in person with people, it would be in the context directly with a group, in proximity to the group, and I would draw on a wall or some sort of surface. Now I've mostly been drawing through an iPad and digitally, but essentially you're still trying to help people see what they're talking about in the moment. And in terms of the different art movements and different ways of approaching scribing, when people have asked me this in the past, I wondered about the difference between graphic recording, graphic facilitation, and people in our field of practice wonder all the time about the language that we use to describe ourselves. And I've been working with the Presencing Institute for about 15 years, and someone named Otto Scharmer, and he developed a model around listening called 4 levels of listening. And so when people asked me about these differences in our practice, I applied the levels of listening to a framework that I simply called levels of scribing. That not very original, and that I think helps define some of these differences between approaches and styles. So something more literal, like a naturalist painting of a landscape, would be more like level 1, which I describe more as mirroring, where you're just directly reflecting back something that you hear. And then level 2 is more about differentiating, like when you're starting to split apart the facts so that you can see more facets of a picture. And I wonder if that's more like cubism or something, where you're trying to see all the sides of something and you kind of flatten it out. Level 3 then is around connection, where you're trying to establish more relation and bring the heart element into the drawing, the heart in the room, your heart as a scribe. And it's a different kind of meaning making when you're connecting. And I wonder if that would be more like, I don't know, in art movements, but that might be more, I'm thinking for some reason of like a country scene where no, not even, but I'm thinking of murals or something where it's like big and complex, but you're starting to really get the feeling of it, like Diego Rivera murals or something. And then level 4 is more generative, like that's where it's a more energetic place, and that might be more impressionistic, where you're catching the light, where you might not have clear line, but you have some sense of boundary. But really, at the end of the day, it's integrating all of these. It's no one. It's the ability to discern what's useful when. I mean, that's the facilitative act. Regardless of what it's called, you want to be able to know. It's a situational awareness. You want to know what's appropriate when, and have the skills to bring that. And then also integrate them into one picture. So there might be a generative element right on top of something that's more factual. And they go together because it's the same conversation. Does all this make sense? That was a very roundabout way of answering.
I love it. And it makes total sense. And you anticipated my question. I was like, can you really set these apart, the 4 levels of scribing or the four directions of art, or whether they rather fit into one, because you need to apply all the different levels in a conversation. And I wonder where the unsaid would come in, because very often it is about making the implicit explicit. That's the facilitation part. And I can imagine that by the participants observing the scribe and the picture of what they are talking about evolve, it will also impact their conversation. So there's a kind of a loop in there. Mm-hmm. So how do you capture the unsaid, and how do you integrate then let me phrase it differently. What is your perception of impacting the group? Mm-hmm. And can you actually manipulate is a big word, but force a direction upon them because of the representation?
Well, I think that's a fine line with this profession, because there are such quick feedback loops, like you say, because people are seeing their words almost immediately after they speak them. And I really would encourage anyone picking up a marker in this role to be very, very careful of not manipulating people to their own views, and being very conscious of their own bias and trying to suspend that as much as possible, and to be of service to the group and what's trying to come through. So honoring the implicit order of what's wanting to be born into the room, and consider that the drawing is a vehicle for that to come in. So in dialogic contexts, you might have a group in a circle, and there's an understanding that the center of the circle is where meaning can come through. And everyone is there as a collective. I mean, Otto uses the term organ of perception. So in dialogue, there's this collective where something is coming through. In scribing, you might be on the edge of a room or in a Zoom box, but there's the same possibility for meaning to come through you as not a channel like a medium channel, but as an opening from the more implicit part of the field, the social field, into the more explicit part. And I'm very conscious of that when I'm working. And yeah, I guess when if I'm working with a client or in a situation where a group is wanting that, because again, it might be a much more straightforward engagement, and they don't care, the group might not care at all about anything coming through. They just want what's spoken on the paper, and like, that's it. And that's fine. That's totally fine and useful. But when a group is wanting something unknown to come through, then I have to pay very close attention to silences between people, the pauses, even in someone's speech pattern. How are they active in their speech, and how are they spacious? And that says something too.
And how do you represent that?
Well, that's like the beauty of it, is you just let it be. Like sometimes things don't need representing, like a space on a page, an empty space on a page, a white area, or an area that isn't drawn can sometimes speak volumes. It doesn't have to have words to say something. So the ratio and the proportion of what's drawn to what's not drawn, or how something is drawn, or how things are connected. Having two expressions, for example, on complete opposite sides of a drawing that are connected by a line across the drawing establishes a sort of relationship that you don't need to spell out the relationship. You can use a line to establish a relationship, or you can put things inside of a circle or outside of a circle, or just the proximity that you work with of words and pictures and gestures, visual gestures, textures, colors, all those things factor into how to create spaciousness or density.
And what comes up to my mind, or the way how I visualize it, is almost different, that you can almost feel the noise or the dynamics of a session in the final scribe.
Mm.
So if you look at a scribe of someone else, can you sense what the dynamic was and how?
Sometimes I think it depends on the attunement of the scribe to the situation and their ability to let go of some of the noise. So if they're able to connect in with like the taproot, in trees, there's the taproot, which is the primary root coming down, and then all the other roots around it. If you can connect with the taproot of the group, then of the meaning. But I get caught a lot in being very distracted by all the things. My own head is like, oh, I should represent that. Oh, I should include that. Oh, I should include that. That's important. And it's easy to not stay connected to the deeper meaning or the core purpose that's in the session. I think I'm straying from your question though.
That's absolutely fine.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by the answer because my question was triggered by how you explained that the silence is represented by white space, maybe, or the unsaid is represented by being inside or outside a bubble. Yeah. So there are nuances of expressing it. And I can imagine that you would be able to read a scribe of another master scribe, let's call him like that, in a different way than one of the participants maybe, or someone whose eyes hasn't been taught to see what is behind the different pictures and the...
Yeah. So I'll give you two examples because I think the answer is yes. And I've also been thinking a lot lately about scribing as a social art of our time and how it's reflecting not just a conversation in the room, but the times, what we're going through as a society, as a species, the planet. And so two examples that I think reflect that beyond what's just in a room is, I'll start with my own and then I'll speak to my colleague Olaf Baldini, who I was in a session the other day with, and he was scribing on paper. So I've been working on my iPad and I've been working with a lot of density of layers and colors, and the images are there's a lot of blur to them. Sometimes it's not clear what you're supposed to look at. Sometimes there's a big shape that's looming. They tend to be somewhat dark, like the colors are very saturated and there's not a lightness to them at all, my drawings. And they're so different from how I drew when I was in person with people. But it's felt to me in the past 2 years, I didn't sit down and think, this is how I want to be scribing on an iPad. But the more I started using this technology to scribe, which I hadn't done before, so it was a new method, this is how it was coming out. So I just went with it, and I'm still experimenting with how far I can stretch the intensity. Mm-hmm. And that's because I feel like, I think that's an accurate reflection of what we've been going through. Is we are not clear now. I'll speak for myself. I am not clear. The world feels thick and dense with challenge and opportunity, but the dark and the light are both in the picture. And so I've just let myself continue with this style that feels very, has a very particular feel to it. And I think if I go back in person, I have no idea. You can't translate this kind of layering. I can't translate this kind of layering to a medium like dry erase surface where, your inks are limited, or paper, which paper gets saturated and then, you can only do so much with paper. But anyway, that's my example of 10 years out. If somebody were to look back at the images from now that I've been generating, I think they wouldn't read the words as much as they would read the feeling of these images as being representative of the time. The other example is my colleague, Olaf Baldini, who worked on paper for a sense-making session that I was part of last week. And he was using inks. He was working on brown paper and using inks and washes with a brush and a little roller even. And he put on these big gestures before people even started speaking. He put on these big gestures of these large marks and then very few words. I think there were maybe 10 words in the whole image. And the feeling at the end, like what we all read was just this amazing kind of Armageddon, like this destructive power that was going on, the battleship sinking, fire. And the main theme was, how do we hold this intensity? And so he came at it from a very different way. But I think if you saw our images side by side, they look completely different, but they both speak to how we're handling the intensity of our times. And again, this isn't necessarily, it was set, they are session specific, but it's kind of overarching.
Mm. And
you have to edit this out. Again, I don't think I'm answering your questions well, but it's what's
I think you answered them beautifully.
Okay.
I get. If the audience gets as much food for thought as I do, then we're covered.
Okay.
Because in the beginning, you said that the scribe is not a medium. And while I heard you speaking right now of the scribe starting to draw before even the first word has been spoken, for me, this sounds pretty much as a medium. So it's almost this, you absorb something that isn't said, but it's present in the room.
Yeah. So I was thinking about this before we started speaking, that I think it's that the scribe has an attunement to, it's a field awareness. So it's an ability to feel into the moment and be with the moment. But I don't think we're channeling something spiritual from another place. Although I would say at times I felt like there's a mystery in the room, but there's a mystery, and I think something will happen, and you'll be drawing, and all of a sudden there's the thunder, and the thunder completely meets what you're doing. And so there's just an awareness more than a channeling, I think. And that awareness comes from being able to get out of your own small bubble and be with others and just sink into the deep humanity in the situation. And just connect with the best possible spirit of the people and the place.
Mm. Are you paying attention to body language and to how the participants react? And then how is it different online as opposed to on site? Because on site, you clearly see if someone looks at your work and then has a facial expression, as opposed to someone looking in the camera and you don't know whether they're looking at your work or having a facial expression because of something else.
It's interesting. In a room, my back is to the group, so I'm not paying attention to body language at all. I'm only paying attention to the language of the voice, the tonality of voices. And so there are the words people are speaking, but then there's also the tonality. So where is it coming from in the person's body? Does it sound like there's fear around what they're saying, or are they speaking with confidence? If there's a conversation going on with a lot of people, there's a rhythm to it, and you might hear certain voices coming in more than other voices, and then you might hear a smaller, quieter voice come in, and so there's like a music to the sound of the voices. And then on Zoom also, I'm really not looking at what people are looking at. I think I'm still very shy about it and get very nervous with the idea that people are watching anything I'm doing. And when I have to scribe, I just sort of tune in to the content and try not to think about the audience, the idea of an audience. But I try to just experience it as we're all here to hear something or share something together. And I'm participating in a slightly different way, but I'm one of the group. And I mean, in a room, if it's been a conference or like a week-long learning session or something, it's always great to see how people engage with the drawings at a break. Of course, you want the drawings to be useful. Like, you want the drawings to have a purpose in the room, not just be pretty decorations. And so, of course, it matters if people are looking at them or not. But while I'm drawing it, it kind of freaks me out. So I don't pay attention to that fact. I just carry on with what I'm doing.
Which actually makes sense because you can be so biased by misinterpreting facial expressions, or by maybe then starting, I can imagine just if I was there, there would be so much going on between my ears with overthinking. Am I interpreting this right? Am I hearing what they really said? Am I sensing the right thing? Who am I to actually put my own voice and perspective on it? Because at the end, you're drawing a mirror to them, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how would you, so when you think of how participants then engage with your drawing, can you recall a moment where you were like proud because you could sense and feel that your drawing was really adding value? And how does this manifest?
It is harder to feel that way through Zoom because the drawings are small. The drawings are bound. They're smaller than a head size even. Even if somebody has a large monitor and during a session or at the end of the session, they can pin the drawing to the full size of the monitor, it's still smaller than a body size. Whereas in a room, it's surrounding. The drawings can surround the people. And so is there a moment where I was like, felt proud or like, yeah, this was a good drawing? Yeah, I've had moments like that. Some have been technical where I didn't think I could do what I was supposed to be doing. Like there was one session. Okay, well, I'll give some examples afterwards. So some are, technical where I accomplished something physically I didn't think I could do, like a certain scale of a wall or using certain materials I wasn't used to using. But then other times there are moments where you draw a word before the word is spoken. And those are sublime, where you're just so in tune with what's going on that there's a synchronicity, that's happening. And then, it's not you. It's not me drawing the word. It's me drawing the word. But that's when there's another type of like attunement, like I spoke to earlier, going on. And then I feel good, like I'm with, like I'm here. I'm really here. And I'm open and joined with these people, and we're together. And that feels always pretty unique to me and pretty rare. And I have missed that in the past 2 years, to be honest. I don't experience that digitally, not being physically with people in the same way. So even if I'm drawing and I'm not looking at people, I'm with them. So it's like if you're sleeping in bed, with someone and your backs are to each other and you're not touching, you don't need to be touching to feel the heat of someone or know that there's a presence there. Or even in a room, like when you're with someone and they're in the same room or another room, you can be aware of someone's presence. So it's like that when you're scribing in a room. And so I think that the really good moments for me have been when I'm touched, like I'm changed as a human being because of what I'm experiencing and hearing, not only at a cognitive level, but like the essence of me is touched. Those I would say are the best moments. And if that happens for me, my belief is that comes through the drawing somehow, and people would connect with that in an implicit way. Like it might not be pointing to a word on the drawing and saying, oh, that was really, people do that too, where they say, oh, that was exactly what was said, or you synthesized it so well. But it's more of the feeling. If somebody just gets the feeling of it, of the moment through the drawing, that to me is really like, that feels like success.
Hey, since you are listening to this podcast, I was wondering whether you get enough opportunities to exchange, practice, and experiment with other facilitators. Have you heard of the Never Done Before Facilitation Festival? It's a 24-hour global event that is co-created by its participants and delivered by some of the most popular Workshops Work podcast guests. Visit neverdonebefore.org for more information. Use the code WORKSHOPSWORK to get a 20% discount. The festival starts as soon as you join. Now, back to the show.
I see the value of the drawing, that it's this emotional connection to the information. And that's what we remember best.
Mm-hmm.
So if we would read the minutes, we forget them. If we look at the drawing, we have an emotional response to it and we sense the emotions in the drawing through the pictures.
Sometimes. I mean, it also happens that people get lost in the drawings. They don't know, like they want to know what I should say, my drawings, because other people's drawings are usually more clear than mine, especially now mine are so have all this density going on. If people weren't in the room and look at the drawing, they might not have a good sense of what was happening, which I think it serves people having a connection to the feeling of a session. But if there's a lack of clarity in the words, then the people who were in the session or not in the session and looking at the drawing might not be able to reconnect with what was being talked about if the words aren't clear enough. So I think it's a balance between the feeling and the cognitive and the more emotional aspects of it. It's hard, because you want to get the accuracy of what was talked about, and you want to get the accuracy of the, gestalt or yeah.
And then there's the aspect of the art. Right? As an artist, someone who studied art, can you disconnect it, or is it for you an artistic expression? And when is it more art and when is it more information, or is it always the merge of two?
Yeah, for me, it's always art. And for me, it's always an art form. But I see people who've done sketch notes or like aesthetically more clear or more straightforward drawings of a talk. And I'm amazed and I'm in awe, thinking like, oh, it still is beautiful and it has a certain aesthetic to it, but the person isn't overly concerned with the artistry of it as they are of like getting the accurate information. And I always think that those are really great. The sketch noting, I think, is a really great method, but I get carried away with the color. So yeah, I get like lost in my own creation sometimes, which, I have to be careful for.
Or not. Maybe I can imagine, as you mentioned earlier, that you have to be clear also with your client what they're expecting. Do they rather want the literal representation of what has happened, or maybe a more artistic interpretation?
Yeah.
And I wonder whether when you have this conversation, so I can imagine that then the clients would just choose a certain scribe because you're known for how you work. How do you feel with the creativity of an artist? So to bring your own interpretation to it, which is at the heart of art, right? Is this taken away? Can your creativity still serve the group or represent the group?
It's a really good question. And as you're saying this, I wonder if in the past 2 years, I've started to take too much liberty with the artistry of everything. And if I'm doing justice to these conversations by giving myself more permission to be more painterly with the drawings, I don't know. I think there's a line of, if it's generative scribing, then we would want the drawings to facilitate the social field, like the deepest potential of the social field. But if it's pure graphic recording, then I think you want it to be crisp and clear, the content specifically, and not have a lot of the extra meaning or feeling brought in. Because, yeah, when people come to me, sometimes they know and sometimes they don't know how I've been working, and I need to know what they're expecting and see examples of what they've had before. And I send a lot of work to other people, depending on different people's styles and what I think would be a better fit for clients. I've just gotten more careful over time so that maybe I can be more free with it. Also, to be honest, it's been a hard 2 years for everybody. And combined with my stage of life, I'm 56. I've been doing this for, I think, since I was about 28 or 29. So I've been doing this for a long time. And my processing ability is not what it used to be when I was in my 30s, my brain doesn't function as sharply as it used to. And the times feel more complex than they used to feel. And so I really am just trying to do whatever I can do to keep scribing. So if it means using more color, I'm doing that. If it means working with clients who are open to a generative approach, then I'm doing that, because I can only be true to where I am now and what I'm able to do. I don't know if that makes sense, but there's also maybe a fit of like which scribe is the best fit for which client or which situation.
And I wonder whether this has to do with maturity. So that's what I hear is you said you lost of your sharpness, but what I sense is that you replaced it by sensing and by taking a more creative approach, meaning that you trust your senses more and yourself as a medium. And what I wonder is different groups have different needs. Maybe some want the representation for those who are in the room to extend the conversation. So if I see a mirror of the conversation that I was in, then maybe I need more depth and more abstraction in order to spark a different sort of conversation. Whereas if the group is maybe less mature or they need the representation for those who are not in the room, then you don't want as much abstraction, but you want the clarity and crispness of what has happened.
Yes, all of that rings true for me, what you say. I would add that as a facilitative act, I aspire to be holding a potential for the group a bit beyond where they already know that they are or would name for themselves. So if a group says, so I do a lot of work with professors and drawing for lectures in courses. And in this case, it's very straightforward what the content is. They have their PowerPoint slides. There's a certain script that they're following with what they say in the order of it. But I still hold the potential that somebody in the group would make a connection with that content to something else. Like it could be straightforward. Maybe it's like if you're thinking of making a soup, you follow the instruction, you put in all the spices you're supposed to put in. Somebody's expecting to have squash soup, but then you think, what would go well with squash soup? And maybe you also bake a bread, or maybe you think about if I were to add sage, like the spice sage, that's not called for in the recipe, but that would enhance the dimension of the flavor. And so I like to hold possibility for what's there to grow and expand and deepen, even if it's a little bit. You know, that's like the container work. Like you want to have a container that can hold more possibility and more disruption than is currently known.
I'm intrigued by the scribing of a university lecture. And I'm wondering, just out of curiosity, has a professor then used maybe the scribe instead of the PowerPoint presentation? So basically to turn it around so that the first time he does the lecture, you scribe, and the second time he used the scribe to actually give the lecture.
Not with my scribing, because mine is too dense. If it were sketch noted, like if it were somebody where it was very linear and or graphic recording where it's very linear, then maybe, yeah. The RSA Animate videos are a great example. Professors use those to illustrate a point where somebody's speaking and what they're speaking is literally drawn out in illustrations. And in that case, they could use it. But mine are so integrated, these pictures that take 90 minutes of a lecture, sometimes 2 hours of a lecture, or even 3 hours, and into one, rectangular picture. So it's not linear. So I don't know if they could speak to them.
And what is their intention or ambition with the representation? Is it for the students to help the students to get deeper and further?
Yeah, I mean, when I do it with professors, it's in the context of week-long learning programs, or even month-long programs where one cohort is going through a certain journey over time, and the drawings are meant to help anchor key content and also facilitate the students or the learners making connections between different bodies of work. So there might be one professor speaking about risk management, one might be speaking about operations, another about corporate finance, another about systems thinking. And each one of those presentations is unique and full. But then if you're a learner over 5 days or 5 months, you would start wanting to weave together some of those ideas. And I think that the scribing helps with that.
Would you do this work for them or support them to really also link the scribes to see connections that if they're different professors, they don't know, but you know?
Well, sometimes when I do these sessions live in a room, the professor on Thursday will come in and see the previous sessions from Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and they'll do a quick walk. They might, sometimes some do and some don't, walk around the room just to get a feel for the headlines. And so then when they're starting with their presentation, they can verbally weave in like, oh, I see that so-and-so spoke to feedback loops the other day. So in finance, feedback loops look like such and such. But sometimes they don't do that. And, you have to remember, I'm talking in like best case scenario. In my mind, what I've created is, my imagination of this practice. What is actually real for people? I have no data. This is not going on any kind of survey or data that's been collected over time about the impacts of the scribing. So I don't know. Sometimes at breaks, like I mentioned before, when I see people looking at the walls during breaks or, at the end of the day or before day starts, they might ask me, I might draw something and they have no idea what I drew because I'm not a very good illustrator. And so they'll say, like, what was this supposed to be? And I'll say, oh, that was an icon that was meant to represent risk. And this person was speaking about risk here, and then risk came up over there. And so then I might stitch together some themes, but I think people do it on their own, or maybe I'm making it all up. It doesn't happen. I don't know.
And then, it's a facilitator's mindset. It's not in your control, right?
Yeah, and in these cases, they're not really facilitated. These aren't really facilitated. These are classrooms, so it's kind of different than a program. Where if you're scribing for a program, well, I don't know. These are programs, but it's different if the scribing is used as part of the design of a facilitated experience versus an addition on the side of the wall. Like how integrated the scribing is to the design. So if the professor or another facilitator during a week makes a point of creating space for people to look at the work, at the drawings, that's different than if the drawings are never included in any kind of reflection.
Which almost sounds sad, because then why would you have that?
Yeah, but this is where it doesn't ever really make me sad. It does make some scribes sad, and some scribes, rightly so. Some graphic facilitators, it is important to be introduced so people know you're a person doing this work. And it is nice to be included in design. And some people have more strong opinions about it than I do. For me, it is an element of the container for the group. If I'm not introduced, I don't have a big problem with it. It's a reflection on it's just information for me of, where the group is at. Whatever. I don't take it personally. Say that if I'm not introduced, I don't take it personally. But if people don't pay attention to the drawing, it's a little sad because it's a lot of effort, but I just trust that it serves some purpose. It serves some purpose. Maybe it's not today. Maybe somebody will see the drawing years down the road, or they'll see it, online in somebody's Twitter banner, or they'll see it somewhere else and it will have a different effect than it was intended to have in the room or in the one session. So these drawings travel and you don't know. People doing cave art weren't thinking that, 20,000 years down the road, some person will be looking at this drawing in a cave. So we don't know what these drawings, we don't know what the lifespan of these drawings will be or who they'll touch or what,
Yeah.
So of course there's a meaning in the day and in the session, but I just trust that who they're meant to touch, they'll touch, and what they're meant to do, they'll do. And I just do the best job I can, you know.
Beautiful. And I was even thinking of sometimes when we see the illustrations on social media, for instance, just from the art form, we were not in the session, but still we're taking something away, we're learning something, have our own interpretation of the representation. Would be interesting to have sort of a museum or a gallery, different scribes, to just spark conversations around it.
People say that a lot. I've heard that, and maybe it will happen one day, you know, but social media is in a way a kind of gallery. If you look at all the images, depending on how people are subscribed or engaging with it, scribes share it. This stuff is shared. There are a lot of images out there, and I don't think there's a lot of sense making going on between the images. So the images around climate, for example, if you looked at all the things that have been scribed about climate, there'd be a lot of information there. But I don't know what that would yield. You know, I don't know. It's like you could collect apples from an orchard and you could just eat the apple, which would be like looking at one drawing, or you could make something like applesauce or apple juice or cider or something out of the apples that takes it to another place. And we haven't done that yet with scribing. We're still at the apple level.
Exactly, because then if you only have one cider, that's maybe interesting and tasty. But if then the other apples from the other ciders come together and you taste the same product, but from different regions, and they all taste differently. So
absolutely. Like if you had like an indigenous lens on climate and you had a lens from the countries that are being the most impacted, but have done the least to create the cause of the climate catastrophe, and then the lens from where I am, you know, Boston, Massachusetts in the United States, you'd have three very different perspectives on the climate conversation.
And this would even spark in a kind of meta conversation, but just seeing the representations of the conversations that have happened without being there. I think this can spark an incredibly interesting conversation about what's happening and how a conversation between those actors could happen.
I think it will come. We're just like recognizing now that we have an orchard, you know, so we're just busy kind of tending to these individual apple trees, but I think it will come. And then you have, you know, like you were starting to allude to, you've got one type of cider and another type of cider, and then you've got other types of juices. And so if you put a meta conversation around climate through, or a meta sense making through these images on climate next to a meta sense making on healthcare systems around the world, next to education, next to government and policy, then I don't know what would be seen, but you'd have a different kind of systemic map than we have today about some of these topics. Just by the fact of like all these pictures representing so much data and so many perspectives.
Yeah. And because of the art form, they facilitate then a conversation.
There's something else too. I don't remember what you were saying before, but something with social media. When you see these images, even if you don't understand them, if they're not in your language, you can't understand them, you weren't there, they don't make sense. There is this element of care, I think, that comes through where someone was listening very closely and making the effort to translate or transform what they were hearing, what they were listening to, what they were taking in into this form, into this visual form. And I think that I would like to believe that that feeling of care comes across as much as the information itself.
Is this a way how you would distinguish a good scribe from a bad scribe, if this is even possible, that you feel the sense of care and the depth of listening?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say there are no bad scribes. I would really advocate that anyone who's trying to listen and draw is doing it in service of insight or in service of helping people see something or see differently or increase our ability to see and understand. So I don't think there's any bad. There might be different skill levels. And I was speaking before to these levels of scribing. There might be people who can approach different levels or have a different ability to integrate the levels together. But I think anybody who's doing it cares. I got a little lost in my heart there. I forgot what your question was.
I was wondering whether you could, and maybe I rephrase it without the judgment of good and bad, whether you can sense the degree of care and ability to listen through the scribe.
Yeah. I would say it's a feeling, like you feel it or not, like you feel the care or not. It's like when, maybe somebody makes, this might not be a good analogy. I was going to say when somebody puts together a party and, if they open a bag of chips and put it on the table in the bag, that's one level of care. If they put it in a bowl, that's another level of care. If they put the chips and they make some homemade salsa together with the chips, that's another level of care. So what are the conditions, like when we're scribing, what are the conditions that we're conveying through our drawing that convey our level of care and attention?
And it was just, as you were speaking, I was thinking back to the soup, and I think we can taste the care, or maybe maybe it's not the care, but the passion. And I think when we listen to musicians, they can play the same song and still you feel it. Your entire body reacts to it. And I can imagine that with a graphic representation of a session, you get a similar sense of whether there was passion and care involved to a higher degree.
Absolutely. I think it's a felt response. You know it. You know when somebody cares about something or not, right? I don't know. I think
human instincts.
I think it goes back to something maybe really primal of like knowing when we're cared for and when we're being nurtured by something or not.
Because this makes us feel safe. And hence we open up.
Beautiful.
And maybe that's also this passion and care can only come through the work if we're really, if you're really open to receive it and to feel it, to translate it then into the piece. And
it is a we, by the way, because it's not just me drawing. It has to be a we, Yeah.
Beautiful sentence. Thank you. Hello, listener. Are you tired of listening to my podcast voice praising our sponsor Session Lab in each episode? I think it's time to pass the mic over to you. So if you are as much of a Session Lab fan and user as I am, please share your experience and praise, and don't be shy of add a sentence of self-promo. Send me your soundbite, and you might hear yourself on the next show and find your name and URL in the show notes. I'm looking forward to hearing from you.